soldiers from dying on the war zone unfairly by modernizing, by pushing the whole war to modernizing their own military base, and in the future developing into ultimate picture into a modernized war. But first, let me describe how exactly this kind of modernization looks like. Three things here. The first thing here is that the automation of war machine, i.e. the like drones, i.e. the like cars that doesn't require you to drive, etc., etc. So second thing is that, okay, special automation weapon apply in small battle, like face-to-face combat, etc., in small field. And third is that large strategic weapon that are like long-term, like very long distance damaging missile, etc., etc. here. So why we are going to, so this is how the modernization looks like. To provide you a more vivid picture, we believe that a modernized like army can actually largely reduce the number of soldiers need to participate in the war, but rather more soldiers are actually handling the drones, the machines to actually operate the war here, which can actually largely prevent the death from the soldiers. But before that, any POI from opposition side? No? Okay. So what I'm going to tell you today is that first, that why being soldier itself essentially is a actually negative thing for every soldier, no matter if you have been or participate or not in a war or not. And second thing I'm going to tell you is that how actually this kind of modernization can actually reduce the amount of soldiers and reduce less international conflict by limiting the number of our overseas military bases. And eventually I'm going to tell you how it can provide stronger deterrence for the United States, as well as push other big countries to further modernize, or even small countries to modernize their technology, which eventually will lead to an overall better picture for us, for humanity as a whole. First, is that why being a soldier itself is a that negative impact? Look, we have seen from so many stories telling us that, okay, innocent soldiers sent to a warfield, even if they are fighting justly, but still there are lots of people actually die in warfield here, right? So even if they didn't die there, it's still very likely they are going to get into PTSD, spend times and years to recover from it in these cases. And moving on, even if we believe that, okay, you're simply served as a soldier, you're so lucky, you don't actually need to go to the warfield at all. Still, this is quite negative. If we take a look about, is that because a large amount of soldiers, they spend 5 or even 10 years in the military, they spend all their time learning how to kill people, how to shoot, how to, all those kind of combo, all have fighting. But what after those 10 years? It's not like any substantial job like others, like engineers. It's not like any teachers, etc., etc. After this kind of program, army program, and they come back with their nation with a medal, with honor, yes. But however, it's still hard for the society to accept them because they lack of the capability to readapt into the society and learn what they need to learn. And even if we believe that there is actually adaptation program for soldiers to better get into the society, still we believe the time they wasted in these 5 or 10 years made them hard to compete with everybody else in this case. Yes, any POI?
Here.
Yeah.
Why do the lives of these soldiers that consented to be part of war in the first place matter when you lose your capacity to have influence over other nations, when you scale back your military size?
Oh, okay. The first thing here is that we never ever agreed that it's going to actually lose the deterrence. In fact, I'm going to tell you that why it's going to provide more deterrence. And second, yes, we don't deny that they actually give the consent to the nation. But if you actually think about it, why they will have such consent in the very first place is because the country keep telling them, okay, this is an honorable thing. This is a good thing for you. No army are going to tell you, okay, you get in, you may get PTSD, you get in, you may get shot in the war zone. No, they tell that you sacrifice for the country is an honorable thing. They never tell you that it will be hard for you finish your 10 life of service and get back and live a poor and lonely life. They treat you like a hero only in the army, but after the army you will be treated like shit. Nobody ever tell you that. In this case, their first are probably being brainwashed in this case by the patriotism, and the second, even if they are not being brainwashed, we believe that they haven't been fully informed to get this consent. And third, even if we believe that they have such consents to do so, still it's our responsibility to provide them a better choice in terms of this, like the worst choice possible here. Okay, second, moving on, okay, why there will be less soldiers? First is that, okay, because more money will be devoted to modernization, there will be less soldiers who actually will be and need to be participating in war in these cases. And second, with less money to devote it in extending or oversee military base, we can see more soldiers who have been forced to leave their home country for times of years can have the chance to go back, and as well as like will go back in the end, don't need to go out to separate from their family. Those are fathers, those have wife, those fathers, they have kids, etc., etc. But also there will be less international confession. Noting that we have seen tons of international confession that like countries feel more threat when the military base is more near them. Compared with actually one thing is okay, missile that is far away from me, and the other hand is that okay, there is right another military base right next to me. There are more likely all kind of confliction happen on all those cases. We think there is enough international confliction from between China, Korea, Japan, or because of American military base. Not to mention the military base itself are actually causing confliction with the domestic country, i.e. United States soldiers actually having confliction with Japanese in Japan, etc. Is that the military base also happen in Korea, etc. So why is it even, further is that, okay, eventually, why still a country can provide deterrence here? Notice that, look, countries are not going to sit there secretly develop their weapon, okay? They have a show area to show you the strongest, powerful weapon to actually to the all world to show their deterrence. So once you know that a country can simply boom you from a large distance, but you don't have any power to fire back, your first reaction is that, okay, first, I'm not going to get touch with this country. And second thing is that I'm also going to do something in response to better develop your actually defending as well as attacking system to try to compete with them, to devote more money in the technology development here based on all this very proud to propose.
Oh, sorry.
All right, I thank the Prime Minister for their remarks. Invite the Leader Opposition to present the opposition's position. Hear, hear.
The info slide explicitly says that this debate is about super weapons such as hypersonic missiles, which means that their opening government's past argument about reducing the soldiers' burden is completely irrelevant in this debate, because this debate is about whether we should have more destructive weapons or not, along with China or Russia. That's why their first argument disappears from this debate. Two arguments from LO. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why the modernization military within itself is rather ineffective for the military advancement of these countries. Secondly, why the expansion of military existence all over the world, why having USA prevents war and conflict comparatively within outside of the house. Firstly, our stance. This debate operates in the context in which the resource is limited, the budget is limited. This is a zero-sum game. This is about the trade-off between modernization and military size, and we prefer military size within outside of the house. First argument, why modernization of military is rather ineffective. Firstly, let's analyze whether modernization is really necessary in the first place. We think this is untrue. Firstly, given that we already have established nuclear weapon, such as chemical weapon, that is already destructive enough to end the humanity of particular region, I don't understand why additional deterrence is necessary in the first place. Secondly, therefore, within status quo, we already have mutual assault destruction. When one country tries to use the nuclear weapon, other country will use it. As a result, China, Russia, or other countries who have the nuclear weapon don't have incentive to use this kind of horrific or these kind of dangerous weapons. Therefore, they want to prevent and avoid the worst case scenario, so they are unlikely to use these kind of weapons. Therefore, there's already mutual assured destruction and deterrence that is happening under status quo. They never told you why additional modernization is necessary. Next thing we hear is, oh, this is likely to reduce the human sacrifice. Firstly, this is untrue, because we don't have even if we invent new weapons, we need someone who takes care of it. We need someone who operates it, who maintains it, and who commands it. So I don't understand these changes. But B, as the information slide suggests, this is about hypersonic missiles, which means that it will be more destructive and it is likely to kill many people, which means that human sacrifice rather likely to happen within their side of the house. Third of all, there's already consent. We think that the fact these people opt into this site, especially in USA, we don't have conscription, so it was the choice of these individuals. And furthermore, even if they go afterward, they are actually cared by VIA. They get things like public housing, they get things like job training from the official statement, and that kind of service already exists under status quo within the United States. So their argument is factually untrue. Secondly, why this creates a lot of harmful collective action within their side of the house when we implement modernization. This is because race to the top, or dilemma of security, is really which pushes each country to exaggeratedly invest and modernize certain military is likely to happen within their side of the house. Why is it more likely to happen? Because as China, when you see USA, which is one of the huge country or huge power within the world, modernizing the military, China will try to modernize as well, and Russia will do the same thing. This repeats over and over again, which creates a vicious cycle in which all countries have to opt into this collective action problem. Why is this something harmful? Firstly, it will be meaningless. The margin between the three countries will stay the same, so the additional cost or the additional sacrifice that is implemented through this modernization is only a waste. But secondly, it will be more huge risk. In the case in which this kind of military or this kind of weapon is used, it's going to cause destructive consequences for the individuals on the ground. Secondly, let's talk about why the expansion of military existence is something important within outside of the house. Firstly, it is alliance with Japan and South Korea and Saudi Arabia. Having this kind of military base is necessary for you to have connectionship with these countries. Why is that the case? A, because geopolitical signal. They can have existence within the particular region and pressure other countries by being there. For example, within Southeast C, because the USA was there within South Korea and implemented certain system, which is a radar which detects different kind of weapon, that pressurized China, and that pressurized China to be moderate and cause deterrence toward China. But B, mutual connectionship with these alliance countries. USA benefits from gaining the place within geopolitics, but also South Korea and Japan and Saudi Arabia benefits from this relationship, precisely because they can be under the umbrella of the United States and they can be protected under the United States. Why is this important? Firstly, simply because we are able to prevent military conflict and more mutual relationship with these important stakeholders when we have more number of military in the first place. But secondly, in terms of economic impact, the fact that these military bases are within the region within itself is beneficial for the United States to maintain the economic relationship or trade routes, which is necessary for exporting things like oil, and which tends to be attacked in region close to Iran, for example. That's only possible when you have substantial number of military bases all around the world. Second impact is that the existence of USA within itself is likely to fear and deter conflicts from happening. Why is it unique to outside? Because when we have greater number of military bases, which is a trade-off of this debate, we are firstly able to have immediate intervention from the United States. Every time you do something, the United States will be there with you. But secondly, United States will be close to you and direct to you, which means that it's more easier for these United States military to operate different kind of missions and have different kind of support towards certain stakeholders within this debate. Conclusion here is that existence of USA within itself all over the globe deters different kind of conflicts or even more severe conflicts that happens within region. For example, in Syrian region or Middle East, the existence of USA within itself created stability precisely because other stakeholder or guerrilla or military group want to prevent a conflict with this United States action within their side of the house, within our side of the house. Why is this important? Firstly, we are able to have a comparatively stable world in which we have less conflict or less chaos because of the existence of USA and deterrence that it creates. But secondly, we are able to fight necessary wars. For example, Somalia or Rwanda, we think we see lots of necessary and sacrifice of the civilians on the ground because USA disappeared. Without the existence of USA, we are not able to ensure a stable and safe war within their side of the house. Because we think there's no necessity modernizing in the first place, or because we think there's uniqueness of having many military around the world, we are extremely proud to oppose.
Wait a second.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their remarks, or Leader Opposition for their remarks. Invite the Deputy Prime Minister to close out the opening government case.
Two things in my speech. First, what the war will be like in the future. And second, why US should be the leader in this trend of war. But before that, several rebuttals. First of all, the opposition team is actually going to a logic fallacy. That is, this motion is never about one way or another, but it's about trade-off, meaning that we are reducing the cost of like a military base in exchange for modernization of weapons. Doesn't necessarily mean we're gonna kill off all the military bases. More likely, the approach for US is gonna save those like military bases that have strategic like position, etc. Meaning we're gonna still like keep those like military base probably in Japan or South Korea for the intention of inhibiting China, and we also like keep the military base in Saudi Arabia for the intention for like for the U.S. presence in Middle East. We're probably gonna like decrease the military base in other areas, in relevant areas, so we can do the modernization. Meaning the huger impact comes from the opposition side. It can still come from the government team. Moving on, they talk about the use the analogy about nuclear weapon. However, the nuclear weapon is never the correct analogy here. That is the reason why the reason why countries do not use nuclear weapons is because it's tremendous impact on the overall human being living under the earth. However, those modernization weapons doesn't hold enough power like nuclear weapons. They won't like eliminate all human beings in the earth. Like once it started, meaning that countries do have the incentive to use those use those modernization of the like super weapons, like in case of wars. That is one of the reasons why US should also get involved in this trend. Moving on, they also talk about the econ benefit. The econ benefit is never mutually exclusive from both sides. They say like how those the military base gonna benefit gonna the U.S. economy, like for example, trading oil. However, we can also by selling those like super weapons to those like Saudi Arabia, etc., to earn a huge amount of money. And this money can only be will only be larger in the Gulf house. Like moving on to our argument. So first of all, what the war will be like in the future. So we told you that the future about the war is no longer about how many people you actually have. It's about how advancing your technology is. For example, a possible scenario is that you never send a single soldier to a particular land, but already win the war. How does the country do that? Sure. Later, they're probably gonna send some like drones or like supersonic planes, etc., or send some bombs directly to that country, like to destroy their military base, etc., like to achieve their purpose. Meaning that in order to guarantee the advantage of the U.S. in terms of war, they have to develop advancing technology in order to like win this war with the lowest cost. And the impact, my partner has already told you, including like the decreasing of casualty in soldiers. The all responded that because there is a consensus among soldiers, so soldiers' life doesn't matter. We think this is not true, right? So even if there is a consensus, noted there are lots of noted that it's not a totally informed way. The government never told you how brutal the war can be. You never know the consequence of it. This consensus can never be counted as a way of not to caring about people at the very first place. Moving on, why US should become the leader in this trend. So my partner explained how this modernization weapon is gonna decrease the casualties and have a better humanitarianism in our world. But later on, there are also things we have to talk about. Notice that this motion is not an active motion. It's like you cannot simply think of this motion from US perspective. There are lots of things we have to weigh about. So what are the things here? Notice that in the status quo or in the info slide, we say, no, okay. So notice in the status quo, the major players in the military base can be US, Russia, China, and like EU. Notice that like EU and the US is actually aligned, meaning that EU actually rely partly on the military supplements from US. That is, in the democratic, in the part of the democracy, there are only US and EU has like significant power in terms of military bases. However, notice that both Russia and China cannot be actually considered as the friend of democracy. That is, the growing power of like dictatorship or totalitarianism can be potentially to threat the blooming of democracy. As we said, as like both the PM and I said about the trend of the modern war, that is, in order to keep the democracy in the Western world, it's very important for US to become the leader in this trend and spending more money on that. Second of all, we say it's not just about US soldiers, it's also about world peace, right? So the power balancing is like this. The ones that they perceive you as a stronger opponent in certain kind of region, they are less likely to initiate war at the very first place. Probably you say that US or Russia won't directly go to a war, but chances are there are proxy war. That is, the possible scenario can be in the ops world is that once US gradually lose its like ability or its significance in the military base, it loses the power, for example, in Middle East, etc. They are more likely to let China or Russia to have a layer of advantage on that. That is, like the power balancing is no longer balanced. They are more likely to have wars at the very first place. So what we told you today, third about the econ, right? We say like since the super weapons gonna be the trend in the future because it has more power of damaging in terms of damaging, and it can save more lives. So meaning that it's actually in countries' interest to have more super weapons. That's how the US, by developing those like weapons, can gain huge econ benefit from that. Based on that, I'm proud to propose.
Thanks, the Deputy Prime Minister, for their remarks, and I invite the next speaker to take the floor here.
So to speak, it is pretty obvious that military bases will be a foremost elimination target when we actually enact this motion. Is pretty clear. The reason is because, as the motion says, there are going to be expenses. But the problem is that there are still national antagonism, which says the US critics say that the expense of national security within the global society as of itself should not be done importantly are truly existing, which is a clear reason why the Trump administration by 2017 are affected by the conservative supporters and their antagonism are actually trying to eliminate the US Navy in the Korean states, which means that if these motions are enacted, or if these expenses are truly going to be like expenses in the trade-off, there is a clear reason why this most vulnerable allocation will be a military basis, which is the clear premise that are supported by the government stance. That's a clear reason why they are actually not responsive. Clarification about the opening government stances. First of all, we don't understand why future war as of itself is important. The reason is, first of all, we don't clearly see how being a leader as of itself is something important with the expense of the national interest and with the expense of diplomacy at the first place. But moreover, we don't clearly see that their presumption is more about that the war is going to happen with no clear explanations of how the war is, first of all, going to be initiated. Rather, if their objective for their like stances is about to not to start a war at the first place, we actually believe that they're actually conflicting with their stances of that state. I'm going to first explain you why this will going to have more tension within the global society, how it initiates the war at the first place. I'm going to explain you how this pre-existence of the military in different nations as of itself is geopolitically important to the United States, starting with how the war will going to be more initiated by government stance. The clear thing I have to remember of the Cold War between the USSR and the USA is their arms race upon nuclear weapon. That's the root cause of the beginning of the Cold War. The weapon development as of itself conveys the heavier implication than simple allocation of the military force. It's not something that you just put into allocation because you're friendly to that constitution, but rather the weapon development itself conveys a heavier implication. Why is that true? If the opening government want to pause the war and sacrifice choices, does not make true, because weapon development is in opposition to Russia or China regarding in this motion, it increases the possibility of the war and the tension as of itself. The reason why the arms race is going to be initiated is pretty simple. First of all, we believe that the weapon of development of the opening countries are regarded as a threat to national security to other states that are actually have to develop the states to more. Because there are underlying antagonism between the US and China will going to consider this as a threat to their national security and a plausible attack to them in their future, which means that they will also going to increase, they're also going to develop in their sense. But moreover, we believe that it's the development of the weapon and the proof of it is a proof of global hegemony, which means that you have national power stronger, you became a leader of the global society. That's a clear thing, which is a clear reason in order to take the authority, China or Russia, where the other state's going to opt in eventually to show the constant increase of their national hegemony and their power to show off the proof, which is a clear reason explaining why the arms race is going to be initiated. Two reasons why arms race is going to not benefit the US nor the global society. First of all, they lose the public support at all. Because in the general poll, we can clearly see that the people go against the arms race or the development of the severe weapon because it actually affects the individual life. But moreover, clearly shown by the NPT Treaty, Non-Proliferation Treaty of the OPCW, the global society as of itself are actually opposing this threat in the weapon development as of itself, which sees that there are no national interests attained into this. The reason why it will actually eventually lose public support and more important is clearly because of this. It worsens the relationship with competing nations. Still, in the current scenario, we can see how the US or the China are actually having a conflict with the trade war as of itself begin with their national hegemony. But if this national arms race are going to be initiated, as we clearly told you the mechanism, if this really going to happen, the individuals who are going to be actually affected by the individual trade war in the economy or in the diplomatic stances, because the people are going to lose products or nationally economically damaged in that stances, which is the clear reason why the individual lives are definitely affected and impaired in that stances, which means that if this individuals and they lose public support, there is directly lead to the life of the people and their public sustain of the government. US government or the international society does not have any incentive to actually to invest into weapons that actually are at the expense of the international relationship and diplomacy that this national geopolitical military in different nations are actually suggesting. That's why even if the war happens, since the people has moved upon the war streets from Israel or Korea, they will have no interest and there are no incentive for those countries to help US, which in a further term, even if the war happens as they clearly stated, there is no ally that this United States can actually have been benefited from, which is the clear reason the plausibility of winning the war will going to be down for the United States, which is a clear reason why the United States don't have any incentive in this. Before moving on, yes. POI from OG.
Noted that it's not US doing nothing, but choosing between military base and superpowers. So how does your harm about like diplomacy or dispatcher about people uniquely in our side of the house?
I think we clearly told you why international things are actually being done and actually are affected by individual lives by the arms race. But moreover, I think the persistence of the militaries in different nations are not a military enforcement of itself, and something in diplomatic can be analyzed, like geopolitical alliance and mutual cooperations with other states. First of all, it's a strategic exchange of the information called as jisomiya between the United States, Korea, and Japan. It happens with physical presence. It can only be detected and prepare early measures by directly being informed in a military state of them. But the more important thing that we want to explain is about diplomatic relations being broken, right? By deeply connected as of itself in the current status quo. if the US go back and refrain from helping those countries right now in the expense of their weapon development in that sense, those nationals have an antagonism toward them, which they will lose the support from the nation at that sense. The diplomatic relationship will going to be done. The two problems are engaging. First of all, the economic damages are actually done. The reason is because the United States actually heavily like rely on the export as of itself, which means that this military intervention can actually lead to the export of the economic expense, which are clear reasons how the United States and China has been trade war at the first place. But whether we believe that antagonism about this United States are actually being formed, which is clearly important for the United States who direly thinks that this importance, the prominence over global society is something important in order to secure the global hegemony at the first place, which the opening government clearly told you as important. So it is very clear, ladies and gentlemen, that first of all, there is no clear legitimate reason to move out from those countries in the expense of this currently sufficient status quo of their weapon. But moreover, we clearly told you how arms race will going to eventually not benefit and de-incentivize the United States of America in an eventual turn. But less than we told you how the strategic development, how diplomacy should be maintained, nevertheless of the case of this OG having clearly told you, which is clear reason why OWO brought you exclusively how things were going to happen and impairs the situation of the United States, thus we're proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader Opposition for their remarks. Invite the member government to open up the back half of the debate. Here.
All right. Just give me a minute. Cool. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that the problem with the way military is construed in the US is that there is no form of way for the US to have stability and control over certain regions if there are no on-the-ground military troops to secure those particular regions in the end. Which is why we think we prefer to live in a world where the US modernizes their military in order for us to not have any sort of problems in terms of troops withdrawing out from these particular regions. And I will explain later on why is that one that is extremely harmful, right? So I will firstly address a few of the concerns coming from side of opening opposition. But essentially, the way in which closing government will enter this debate is that we will posit to you that it is problematic for the US to have physical troops due to the risk of withdrawal as well as the risk of the troops on the ground from, like, for example, acts of terrorism from their particular circumstance. And we will also nuance to you what are the interests of the United States in ensuring stability within the region of, like, Middle East, for example, right? So firstly, in terms of engagement, right? So the first concern that came from the side of opening opposition was that whether or not the public will lose support towards the government in the end of the day. I don't think that it is true that the people will lose support towards the militarization or the modernization of military for the US for a few reasons. Firstly, I think that there is a lot of public interest in terms of the US ensuring that there is stability within particular regions, right? For example, within Middle East, right? For example, now US has a very strong stance or strong interest within protecting the Middle East because of the fact that US has a high dependency of oil and gas to, like, Saudi Arabia, for example, which is why in the end they would likely have military troops within Middle East to ensure that there is no conflict, to not have this particular interest to be destroyed in the end of the day. Or secondly, we think that within the particular, like, Congress of United States, there is a lot of lobbies towards, like, protection of Israelis or the protection of Israel as an ally towards the US. Therefore, the US will always likely have an incentive to want to protect Israel, for example, and to do this, they have to, in a way, contain the conflict that happens within the United States within the Middle East, for example. What then will be the problem? We think that the problem is that the ability for these troops to exist on the ground, or the ability for people to constantly criticize the troops by what was already mentioned in opening, by, like, for example, casualties of these particular troops, or for example, using too much money to, like, put these particular troops on the ground. We think that all of that will be solved by modernization, right? So let's look at a few examples in terms of how withdrawal was particularly bad in the past. So let's look at how when Trump withdraw, like for example, US troops from northern Syria, it seemed as a betrayal of the US to the Kurds, for example, and allowed for the Turkish incursion into the sections of Syria later. So this means that the ability for them to withdraw exists, caters to a lot of conflict within the people on the ground. How then, or what will what will be the comparative on our side of the house? I think the counterfactual is that when we prefer a world in which you modernize this particular military, there is a shift in the way that military tactics will likely occur within this particular circumstance, which means that you will not likely have physical troops within your particular northern Syria, but probably you will likely have more like military surveillance, for example, or you would be able to like fund more money into like resources to have faster drones, for example, right? I think that this also tackles the problem that came from opening opposition, where they talked about the ability for this particular military to not be able to respond as much as physical troops. I think that this is untrue, right? Because the ability for this particular drones to be launched is in milliseconds, literally. You can literally go towards the Pacific Ocean to the Middle East in literally seconds, right? We don't think that physical troops will be one that will be much faster than these particular drones in the end of the day, right? So instead of like deploying these particular troops, you will have like virtual surveillance, virtual peacekeeping that is able to get all of these individuals on the ground protected. And the reason why we think that this comparative is far much better on our side of the house is because there will not be any sort of retaliation from the people on the ground, because their children will not be like killed within this particular circumstance, right? Because they are not funding the, for example, the death of this particular troops in the end of the day. Or secondly as well, we don't think that they will have any form of retaliation from your particular Middle Eastern countries, because the fact on the ground is that these particular countries will likely retaliate by, for example, bombing like military troops on the ground, for example, right? So because they're bombing these particular troops, they will have a lesser incentive for the state or for the government to be able to deploy more troops. But the moment in which we modernize, you will not have this particular challenge anymore, because even if your military terrorist group like attacks your particular troops, it will not be on the behest of American lives on the ground. But before I move on, yeah, sure, clarification.
So wait, are you advocating that we kill people in the Middle East and have the US have an advantage over them just so that you can suppress them? I don't quite understand.
No, I think there is a high misrep. What I'm saying is that status quo already shows that there is like military intervention within the Middle East, because US has a lot of interest within the Middle East on the ground. We think that modernization will allow for a smoother or more of an ease towards that particular militarization towards these particular areas on the ground. That is our stance on today's debate, right? So I'll also look at how then do we change the narrative on the ground, right? Because right now, US is one of the first kind of exporter of weapons in the first place, which is why we think that it is in contention with what was said by opening opposition when they claim that by modernizing, it means that you will not be able to sort of like having competition with other countries like China or Russia. But then it is untrue that US will not be able to compete, because number one, US is the highest exporter of your military machines or military weapons in the first place, which goes to show that they do have the sort of resources in order for them to modernize. This means that US is able to put or funnel money into R&Ds, for example, to have better or more effective kind of modernization of weapons in the end of the day. And we think this is one that is very important, because in the long run, when you're able to produce more efficient and more better weapons in the first place, you're also able to reduce the cost of having to maintain the past weapons that were like the strain in the American economy in the first place, right? We think that surplus of resources that you will get by like researching into more modern weapons that takes away a lot of resources into, for example, deploying more troops, for example, is able for the government to use to funnel into other fields, for example, like healthcare, that we think is in dire need of resources from the American people as well, which is why we think the ability for us to modernize weapons not only caters to more peace within Middle East by not having physical troops and not having the ability to withdraw these troops, but also allow for the US to also improve their economy and also improve the lives of the individuals on the ground. Never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
I thank the member government for their remarks. Invite the member opposition to present the closing opposition's position. Here.
Chair, unlike what OO tried to say, this debate is not just about the US's interests. Unlike what closing government tried to say, this debate cannot just happen in the Middle East. It is a global scale on which the US operates, and we think that its unique position as a bastion of diplomacy, as a bastion of democracy, is what will win us the debate today. So to structure my speech, first I'll go into rebuttals, and then secondly, I'll bring to you an argument about why leveraging their military presence is the only form of preventive posturing that actually is able to bring peace to regions across the world. But before that, I'd like to address opening government. So the first thing they told us is that soldiers' choices are not valid. We challenge this for a few reasons. Because firstly, what they seem to be arguing is that if all soldiers' choices are invalid, that they should completely demilitarize and get rid of the military altogether. But that's not what they're saying. So there seems to be a moral incoherency within their case already. But besides that, we don't understand their metric of saving lives. It's absolutely ridiculous to say that we should prioritize the group of US soldiers over those overseas, over the civilians that they will inevitably kill because these weapons are deadly. We disagree with the way they choose to go about this. Also, we don't think we have to defend brainwashing because that is under extreme circumstances. Militaries do have a lot of information that put out to these people. We would fiat that as well. Secondly, they say they reduce deaths. But firstly, I'd just like to clarify, and I think this frames OG out of the debate already, that most US military is used for peace maintenance. It's not used for things like actively getting involved in wars. Most conflicts happen outside the US soldiers. US soldiers dying isn't part of this debate. But I'd like to engage with them still. Firstly, what is this actually likely to look like in the short term? In the very best case, there'll be less presence of soldiers, but they cannot fiat that to such a large extent, especially in the short term, where we don't have the sort of technology to replace you with a hologram, to replace you with all sorts of these things. Furthermore, we'd like to say that tech is extremely fallible and it has to go through lots of processes of testing. There's no such thing as a zero-soldier battlefield. Secondly, we'd posit that is more deadly. So it's not just about the kinds of things that opening opposition talked about. We're not just talking about the large-scale bombs. We're also telling you the fact that it can be easily controlled by people like Trump, who can simply press a button and get rid of an entire population and absolutely decimate them. We think we avoid this at the point at which we have troops on the ground instead of the kinds of deadly weapons that they want to use. Thirdly, we think that fast solvency isn't the way to solve wars. That's to say that we don't engage in wars by just simply dropping a bomb and killing everyone there. The goal of ending wars to ensure long-term stability and save as many lives as possible. You're unable to do that under your side of the house. Thirdly, I just like to point out a kind of clash that they had within their case, which is to say, they told us that they will keep military bases in high conflict areas, which is essentially like conceding all of our benefits in an extremely soft case. Fourthly, they say that you need to become the leader instead of catching up to China and Russia. Look, China and Russia will pursue these sorts of things because of expansionist ideals anyways. Post-Afghanistan, post-Iraq, the US moved towards more peace. Therefore, we don't think this is something that's likely to happen. They need to get their facts straight. But they never explain exactly why this is the best way to become a leader in the global community of warfare by encouraging an arms race and encouraging militarization and encouraging things like hydrogen bombs to be developed. We absolutely do not stand for that. On to CG. We think it's a complete rehash of what happened in OG, right? But with a specific kind of narrowing themselves into the bracket of intervention in the Middle East. We say that this is completely not applicable to status quo because the US is currently withdrawing from places like Syria, places like Afghanistan. So this does not really apply anyways. They said a few additional things. So firstly, that withdrawal of troops is terrible, which is essentially what their case is advocating for. So we don't understand what they're trying to posit to us in this debate. Secondly, they say that we can have things like drones and surveillance that are good. Look, we can have this with troops as well. What this motion is essentially about is about high-tech things that would happen in the absence of troops. They need to engage on those platforms instead of the most convenient case. But even so, they tell us that there will be resources saved if you don't send troops. Look, we don't think this is valid because you have to invest a lot of resources into developing those things so that they're adequate enough to supplement troops or replace troops in the first place. Therefore, and furthermore, we don't think that you can simply utilize the same political capital and inject it into healthcare. Those are two incredibly different things that require different kind of lobby groups, and you cannot just play a game of resources in that way. That's why we've taken down OG and CG. Now, how do we differentiate ourselves from opening opposition? We tell you that we leverage military presence as a form of preventive posturing, and this perpetuates peace. So we'll give to you analysis and links that opening opposition missed out on. So firstly, the first thing to say is what US presence actually looks like and what its role in the international community is. It has the largest presence in the world, right? So China and Russia is much less. And the unique thing we bring to you is that the US is uniquely important as a global mediator. So it's not just someone who sits there and happens to like dodge into some conflicts, get involved here and there, but global security relies on them. They've brokered the most peace deals in history. I'll take you later. and they are a bastion of human rights. That's to say that they always present themselves as having a moral compass, as putting forward human rights in these instances and standing for things like democracy. So we bring to you a few pieces of analysis. So firstly, why exactly does the president strengthen military alliances? Because what they said on side government is that you can have things like arms sales, and that's good enough to establish a sort of relationship with them. Look, we say that arms alliances are weak and can be reneged upon. The US can easily go back on these things, but they have to protect the people on the ground when soldiers are there. Government cannot have both bases and arms trade and things like increase modernization at the same time, because they have to dilute either one of those benefits. Before I continue, yes. Yes, PI? Hello? Hello? Hello?
Closing or opening?
Yeah, you. Go.
Oh yeah, okay. So if it's true that they are the global bastion of like peacekeeping, isn't it important for them to also ensure that they have the most advanced like militarization as well as modernization of their military?
Right, so the thing to say is that the current global situation is not based upon how high tech you are, but rather how much presence you have. And the reason for this, which we literally just told you, is that having more modern arms, having things like that does not broker strong military alliances. And the only way to preserve peace is to have these strategic alliances. Why so? Thirdly, why we reduce conflict. Countries make strategic alliances with them to get their protection, because and this essentially reduces tension. The US acts as a peacekeeper and exists solely to stop rogue states and preserve human rights. The reason why missile protection is not enough, because by then it's too late. We need to have preventive measures. Missile possession will have countries call your bluff. They'll say, you won't bomb us because we'll bomb you back. These things won't be used until we literally have full-blown World War III. We say that's not enough to deter countries like China from invading the Spratly Islands. Only when US presence was there were they actually backing down. Fourthly, we say improves diplomatic peace processes, because it provides new channels for negotiation. The negotiation of the Camp David and Oslo Accords happened not because they had arms packages, but because they promised protection. These things can only happen, and you can only overcome these sorts of cultural barriers at the point at which we're able to encourage nations on the fence, because global diplomacy and global warfare is not determined by who has the strongest missile that they'll be able to use in one scenario, but rather who can help countries here and now. Very, very proud to oppose.
I think the member opposition invite the government whip to close out the government bench. Here.
Can you hear me? Okay, cool. Just a minute. I think the debate so far really lacks a focus in terms of what are the end goals of both sides, and which I think CG is the only team which clearly outlines this. This motion is a this House prefers debate, which means Gov has to reimagine a world whereby United States modernize their military instead of actually increase the size of their military. So in a world whereby back then United States realized that we needed to modernize, it shifts the kinds of situation to the Middle East. It shifts the kind of reactions that we would have with China and also Russia. So this characterization in itself largely takes out all of the harms that opening option talks about, how all the harms of moving out military from other countries within South Korea and Japan also, because it doesn't apply. Because what instead could happen is that we would increase more military surveillance, or we could increase more drones and not actually take out this, and not actually sending more troops within these areas. So what I'll do in my whip speech is simple. Firstly, I want to look at the absurd accusations from closing opposition, and I'm going to ask two questions from opening opposition. I'm going to re-entrench why closing government is the most important theme in this debate. So firstly, let's look at closing opposition, because I think like there was a largely mischaracterization from CEO when she says that, oh, somehow we are withdrawing troops within these areas, and therefore would decrease the idea the United States influence because diplomacy is really important. The first thing I would say, in a world where we reimagine that the United States chose to modernize its military presence, it will shift the kind of ideas of sending soldiers in these areas. Because I think like the incentive of the United States itself to send in soldiers aren't the kind of incentives that you talk about. And I think it's the converse. In status quo, in the United States, we've seen an increase of lobbying to boycott individuals to join in militaries, or also increase of lobbying to not romanticize soldiers, because it is not necessarily true that you are a patriotic person if you join the military. All of this means that you do not necessarily need a strong military soldier in order to establish your influence with these instances. And on top of that, we need to also realize one thing, because most of the times our warfare tactics that is happening right now is not based on numbers. It's based on the quality of weapons that you have. It's based on the technological advancement that you have in order for you to win the war. So when push comes to shove, they haven't answered the question, if a war does happen and China and Russia colludes with China and Russia colludes together and goes against the United States will lose definitely the war, because even if they have a lot of military bases, their military bases is ineffective at a point in which where China and Russia can always just send a bomb to them. So even if you want to say that this kind of diplomacy is important, it does not come at the expense of the protection of the United States. But the second thing is that the second thing that she said from CEO was that, we need these kinds of influence because we need to establish order. The first thing I would say is that China and Russia, recognizing that they are also fighting the arms race, it has changed to a point whereby not the amount of weapons that you have, it's how technologically advanced weapons that you have. So even if you say that perhaps we do not want China to strike first within Spratly Islands, but they're not scared anymore, because they know even if the United States would strike first or establish their presence, they would have a larger weapon within their arsenal to fight back and always retaliate back to tenfolds, which largely does not create the form of deterrence for China and Russia to not fight back. Given that, let's first analyze. Let's move on to opening opposition. I think opening opposition says a lot of things in terms of why US's hegemony is important, but I think most of the benefits can be co-opted by proving why modernization can create the same amount of hegemony and it does not disrupt US presence within the global market. Namely, they say two things. They say firstly, arms race is important because you need to rally more public support, because we need the United States influence to be really sturdy within the global sphere. Secondly, the United States need to secure the global hegemony. The first thing I would say is that you need to first understand that in a world whereby we accept that we need to modernize the military, we need to modernize US's military, it's not a fight against, it's not a sword fight or weapons fight anymore. The warfare tactic has already changed. So in a sense whereby you need more technological advancements, whereby the use of AI, whereby the use of more accurate drones, or whereby the use of more, the less use of individuals actually going into the certain areas. All of this means that even if you have an arms race that could secure your global hegemony, but all of other neighboring nations around you has changed their warfare tactics. At that point in time, United States lose a lot of their influence and a lot of their hegemony, because they always lose out with neighboring countries and will then lose out the stability within Middle East. That was the reason why my extension was really important, because at a point in time when they lose out within the regional stability, they lose out as a whole. Sure, closing.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So given that we're currently living in the status quo and your case is living in the past, that's to say that we're talking about peace maintenance. So why all these arguments about protecting troops if we're not talking about that? We're talking about the current situations in Southeast Asia, in Korea, where they're just troops standing by and acting to prevent further.
Okay, so this is a prefers debate. So in a world, Garth has to imagine a world where we modernize and instead not expand the military. In a world where we do modernize, we have A, B, C outcomes in comparison to what happens in opposition. So because of that, that's why we say that the angle that we had in closing government was that why it is uniquely the United States' position to secure this, given that they are also one of the global superpowers. They can also use the form of money to pump into more innovation, and they're also one of the main exporters of weapons, and to use that as a form of global hegemony as well, in comparison to more conventional use that you guys needed to protect on your side by using some form of diplomacy and some form of global dependency that might be rendered obsolete in the future. So all in all, I think CG was the most clearest team in terms of explaining to you how is it more important for United States military to modernize their military, So proud to propose.
I thank the government whip for their remarks by the opposition whip to close out the opposition bench and the debate proper. Here.
Okay, can I start? We think the ultimate downfall of both the government houses was the failure for them to tell us why the modernization of these weapons was necessary. When we have the means for mass destruction, when the US has the ability to nuke countries that it deems a threat in the very first place, we think we have the capacity to defend ourselves in times of conflict in the very first place. They never wanted to engage with the things that my speaker explicitly brought to you when they started closing opposition on the US's unique position in the world as a mediator of peace in the international community, when they have the ability to be inside, to be present within countries physically, on the pressure the pressure you have on countries, preventing conflicts from arising in the very first place. That is the thing that uniquely came out from my extension speaker that was largely unresponded to. Before I move on to my issues, I have a few levels of rebuttals for the side of closing government. They told us things like how the US prioritizes the Middle East because of things like trade with Saudi Arabia for things like oil. We tell you the solution that they're providing to you is to withdraw troops that prevent more conflicts from arising in the first place. Example, the Taliban's within Afghanistan. If the US military was never present there, we question whether a peace deal would ever be in the works or in the making in the very first place. We think that the Taliban's would have likely already reacted and killed thousands and thousands of Taliban's in the very first place within Afghanistan's in those countries in the very first place. We think a physical presence is extremely needed in order to prevent these kinds of things. We'll provide you explicitly why a physical presence of a military is necessary, the only way in order to exert pressure, and why simply having more modern weapons doesn't act as a counteractive measure in the first place. So moving on to the first issue, on the ability to control the amount of conflicts that exist within the world. We think the unique characterization that came out from closing opposition specifically was to tell you the interests of the US in the first place. When the US prioritizes the ability for things like peace talks or maintaining or reducing the ability for conflicts to exist within countries, within borders to begin with in the very first place, this is the thing that we brought to you from the side of closing opposition. Why is this extremely important? How do we differentiate ourselves from the side of opening opposition? We tell you that they told you a lot of things about why it's important to maintain pressure, but they never told you as to the explicit outcomes of this pressure exerted and why it cannot exist in absence of a military force in the first place. We tell you these are things that we will prove to you, and these are things we will take on the side of closing opposition. So why is pressure only able to exist in the form of a military presence that's physical, when there are active soldiers in the borders of these countries in the very first place? We think number one, the active presence of a military means it's very visceral for individuals to see. This means if there's a retaliation in the works from the opposing country in the border, there is an active force directly there to block the conflict from happening. There's a barricade for these conflicts to exist in the very first place. The problem with having modern weapons is that these are things that are extremely reactive, that there's nothing to prevent the conflict from arising in the first place. You only have a means to stop it. We tell this is problematic because the end goal in times where there's a where there is high conflict is to have solvency with the least amounts of lives lost in the first place. We tell you, we guarantee this on the side of closing opposition, the point in which we're able to prevent conflicts. Why is this so, and what are the unique outcomes that come out from the side of closing opposition? We tell you that the very fact that the US is there allows for mediation of peace deals to begin with in the very first place. The reason these kinds of things cannot exist in the side of government is because you allow your allies to get attacked. You allow, for example, South Korea to be lacking defenses against North Korea, the point in which you lack the troops to protect individuals on the ground. We tell you when the military retaliates against those countries, the point in which the US withdraws their troops. Because notice that the government cannot have their cake and eat it too. They can't tell you they will still have a large military presence in the very first place, because then they're conceding to all the benefits we told you on why this pressure is important, and they recognize this very thing in the very first place. So these things will only happen, and you lose your allies' support, and there's no use for a military base in the first place if there are no alliances to broker. So this means that you ruin the relationships you currently have with other countries in the first place. Another unique thing that we brought to you is how it's hard for the international or other international countries to invade countries as they please. As notice, they have relations with the US in the first place, and if they have military bases present in other countries, it's hard for them to enact things like bombings, mass bombings within those areas in fear of like sparking outrage in their US allies in the very first place. These are the things that we brought to you. The outcomes that we have are extremely important, because we tell you that even if we cannot solve the conflict fast, number one, we prevent it from escalating to a high varying degree. And number two, we have the ability to negotiate for things like peace treaties and peace deals because there's a mediation force within that. Before I move on, PI from closing.
Sorry. So large-scale protection can still exist when you have modernization to a large scale in terms of surveillance. But the difference is that we have lesser casualties in terms of soldiers, so lesser criticism from Americans. How then are you able to curb that on your side of the house?
The mere existence of surveillance, number one, is not mutually exclusive to the side of closing government. We think surveillance exists within the forms of troops in the first place, but the thing that they're missing out here is how a physical presence directly barricades individuals or barricades opposing countries from invading those very places in the very first place. The threat of a missile launch is something that individuals do not take seriously, or it's something that's reactive at best. So you already have the loss of lives and the loss of casualties in the very first place. And number two, we tell you that the presence of the US troops in there is not to spark conflict, but to prevent it. So we think that the only instance in which you lose lives is the point in which retaliation occurs. But in those instances, it's a far better because you protect individuals on the ground. We tell you we have a net less loss of lives in the first place. And second issue, on what we told you on closing opposition, on the ability to react, the point in which conflicts arise is a lot faster inside of closing opposition because of the reactive measures in which modernization of military exists. When you have missiles, these are things that you only allow, that only happen the point in which a conflict has already started, when it's already too late. And when they told you things like how Trump is able to withdraw troops from Syria, for example, in the very first place, we tell you give him even more power when he's the one that's going to authorize the types of drone strikes that they wanted to have. We tell you a physical presence is needed. Things like drones and surveillance aren't deterrent factors enough for countries wanting to invade you in the very first place. We protect and prevent future conflicts from arising, and we better able mediate peace. Very proud of.